Hello and welcome to Between Two Psychs. Today we have with us Gillian Goodwin, who decided to retrain in psychology and achieved a master's in psychology in mental health and wellbeing. She's deeply involved in supporting training and mentoring education professionals with a strong focus on wellbeing, resilience and professional growth. While still working part-time in school, Gillian is now supporting educators through her company, Goldfinch Enterprises. Today she's going to share the findings of her dissertation research and explain why psychology, self-awareness, and emotional intelligence is vital for educationers to thrive. Can I start, Gillian, with what is burnout?
That's a really interesting question, actually, and it's quite complex. So for me, my definition of burnout is a little bit different to just being physically and emotionally exhausted. I think educators work most of their life being physically and emotionally exhausted. I think it takes a different kind of pathway when educators start to become overwhelmed with their work and the responsibilities. And for me, it's when resentment starts to creep in, a negativity, and then a blame. And then suddenly I feel educators start going down into a spiral. And that's the danger point when burnout happens and people tend to then have mental health and wellbeing difficulties.
In your research, you talk a lot about the role emotional intelligence has in almost combating burnout. Does emotional intelligence reduce burnout? And if not, why not?
Well, my research was really, really interesting. The participants that took part had really great emotional intelligence. They had self-awareness. They understood their own triggers. They were able to prioritize and they had perspective. And that actually helped them with their long service. They were teachers that had been teaching for a long, long time. They also started to recognize their triggers. So they knew when burnout was a possibility. Unfortunately, my research also showed that even though these participants had great emotional intelligence and it supported them in their profession and in their career, a lot of them were still actually deciding to leave the profession, and two of them had already handed in their notice. And they'd got to the point where some of them were saying, I just can't do this anymore. So I feel that the emotional intelligence is still really, really important. It keeps people actually being able to control and cope with the demands of the job. But one of the things that came out is these people almost found emotional intelligence and worked on their own psychology almost just by themselves. So they didn't have any training in psychology, how psychology supports them, how their own psychology and all that information can help them cope and deal with the responsibilities that this profession demands.
It almost sounds like you're alluding to the educators that you work with need more supervision.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is what is key that has actually come out. And I haven't trained in supervision or experienced supervision, but I actually did a workshop for teaching assistants. And I didn't get through all of the content and I apologized for that. But at the end, they said, no, actually, what was absolutely brilliant about this workshop was that we were able to talk, have time to reflect, have time to process, realize that we're not alone in this, recognize that we are still doing a good job, even though it's difficult. And that was invaluable. And I walked away from there and thought, surely that's just a type of supervision.
Yeah, so it's not enough to do it on your own. This emotional intelligence reflected in the moment stuff. Is your research telling us that we need that structured time to sit down and reflect with one another?
I think that would be beneficial. One of the participants in my research who was absolutely determined that they were going to stay in education, they were, no, I know what I need to do. I have a great job. I have my life outside of school. I don't need anything else. I've got it all sorted in my head. I'm very happy. Thank you very much. So I think it does depend perhaps on personalities as well. And some people are quite private and quite sorted themselves and quite grounded. Other people may need to talk about their emotions and express their feelings in order to actually process exactly what is going on in their head. So maybe a bit of both, depending on what would help the educator.
So in your view, the supervision can't be a one-size-fits-all. It has to be bespoke.
I guess maybe there should be a choice. I believe supervision should be offered, absolutely, definitely. Should supervision be forced? That's a question, and I think that's a really good question, because in order to force people to spend this time reflecting in a group situation could actually add maybe more pressure to them rather than actually supporting.
Oh, you're opening up a can of worms here now, because we're getting into the ethical debate. And Mike,
Absolutely.
again, but I'm going to try and anticipate what he's going to say. Zika, if it becomes mandatory, you come into the dilemma between some people are put in their uncomfortable situation whereby they have to reflect on their practice and their emotional state. But who do they serve is the other question. Whose needs take priority?
Well, I mean, this is where I've really enjoyed and absolutely loved everything that I have been doing. I've been in education for over 34 years, and it's always the child. And I think there isn't an educator in the world that doesn't believe that the child is at the center of everything that we do. But what I have learned recently over the last kind of 10 years is that if you do not have a teacher who is well, who is happy, who is able to perform correctly and properly and be comfortable with their job and know what they're doing, the children suffer. If you have a teacher in there who is resentful, who is blaming others, who is unhappy, you don't have a happy classroom, and you don't have happy children, and you don't have children that learn. So suddenly these educators in the classroom, for me, are starting to become, I won't say more vital, but perhaps just as vital in making sure that those pupils receive the education that they deserve.
Yes, great introduction, Gillian. It's really captivating, and I've already got so many questions. But the first one that I just want to kind of ask you is that there are support systems in place in schools at the moment. You know, there's performance reviews, there's regular meetings between staff and line managers, etc. And you're talking about supervision. Is there anything that you're finding from your research and listening to people that would enhance the systems that are in place already? Or do you think that supervision is something that's missing that needs to be implemented in its own right?
I think if you're in a very, very supportive school and there are lots of opportunities, there's an open door policy, and there's lots of opportunities. I actually work in a large school, so there is a team, and you can have 3 teachers and 4 teaching assistants within the team. So there is almost their natural support and opportunities for teachers to actually share difficulties and regulate their emotions and recognise that they're not the only person that's dealing with the particular difficulties or issues of the day. So again, it's all a massive kind of worms, and there's no easy answers. If you're in a small school, and I know through some of the research and some of the things the participants actually revealed, and you don't feel comfortable actually sharing the fact that you're having difficulties because you're concerned about how that is viewed by the management or other teachers. I've worked with teachers who struggle very much with self-comparison and feel that they're lacking because they look at the teacher next door and it seems that teacher is coping better than them.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a very complex kind of situation that we're dealing with. And what I found with some of my one-to-one clients is the ability to talk openly in a very safe psychological space where confidentiality is an absolute, and they can just talk openly and freely to somebody who is not actually anything to do with their school, with their situation, but also works in education. that's what they've actually found quite invaluable.
This sounds like, Gillian, you're saying that the argument for a structured supervision can't be an internal model. Schools, particularly in the primary sector, have to bring in someone external, someone who's trained in supervision. Is that a fair assumption based on your answer?
I think that's a fair assumption. I mean, as I said, I'm not actually trained in supervision or had experience of it myself. But I guess, I think as long as the person, the educator, feels that they can trust the person that they are talking to.
Yes.
So, for example, I actually started having meetings with the early career teachers in my school. Before I started doing the psychology course, I was assistant head teacher. And those meetings were 20 minutes, half an hour, every half term, just to check in, because as you know, research shows that early career teachers tend to leave the profession after 5 years. And because that was a private place and I was trusted, they knew me, then that worked really well. I'm not saying that we did supervision, it was just check-ins. So again, I think what comes down to is not, if it needs to be external in order for those people to open up, then maybe there is an argument for that. But I think it comes to that safe psychological space, which is actually key.
I mean, you're absolutely right on that safe psychological space. And as I hear you speaking, I'm leaning towards a side where it needs to be someone who's trained in it. There's companies around the UK. The one that comes to my head first is Talking Heads, and they work at a national level. And some of their work has been unbelievable in terms of the anecdotal evidence I'm seeing, whereby head teachers are reporting that their decision-making becomes much more sound. The designated safeguarding leads are able to make much more ethically sound judgments rather than, that balancing those dilemmas between budget restraints, staff well-being, what's best for the child, trying to keep the family engaged. When you're trying to do that ad hoc, and you're not trained in safeguarding to the level like a social worker would be, it's a huge burden on a person. And I'm wondering, you alluded to early careers teachers leave in 5 years, within 5 years. I want to get onto that in a minute. But one of the stats that came out of your research was that 43% of teachers leave the profession within 10 years. Yeah. And based on my experience of working with teachers, I say most safeguarding leads are less than 10 years in the job. So I'm wondering, has your research brought out any evidence as to why, more veteran teachers leave within 10 years?
Yes, it has. Again, there's quite a lot of reasons why. One of the things that came out that was quite key from the research was the educators I spoke to felt there were policies that didn't actually help or benefit the pupils. So there was frustration there that part of their role they didn't see. They were following school policies, further education policies, and they didn't see the benefit for the children. They also came out, they felt that they were constantly being judged, that accountability was very, very high, that there was a lack of trust and autonomy, that creativity was disappearing, and that there was more and more expected of the educators and less support and new initiatives, constant change, constant adaptation, and obviously the most obvious is lack of resources, lack of money, send issues, just a range, a myriad of things.
And you alluded to, you didn't allude, you outright said the lack of resources and the funding's reducing year on year, isn't it? In real terms, are teachers able to see, are they able to tell you firsthand why that's having an impact on their decision making and their well-being?
I think it's just frustrating that I think sometimes it's not recognized that these people are doing their absolute best in a very, very difficult situation. And I think sometimes they feel that they are being unfairly or unduly criticized. And maybe there isn't an understanding quite of the difficulties that the role actually is at this present time in this educational environment. We're kind of talking kind of negatively. There is still an awful lot of positive. There's an awful lot of humour that goes on with people that I work with and people that I deal with. And there is an ultimate 100% feeling of wanting to do their absolute best for the students in their care. And I think the frustration is when they can sometimes see what needs to be done, and then there's a barrier that stops them actually getting through and doing that. And that can be very frustrating.
What is that, Gillian? What are you seeing as the resilient factors that are coming out when you talk about the positive side?
Yes, there are some resilient factors there. And I wanted in my research very much to find out the reason why people stayed in education, not the reason why people left. I wanted to try and get some solutions so that I could actually say, well, if we do this, if we do that, if we do the other. Now, one of the key reasons why everybody stayed was because of the relationship with the students, the way they saw the students grow, the impact that they had, the way that they felt they could positively influence these people's lives, that they skipped into their education establishment. And at the end of the day, they said, bye, see you tomorrow. And there was that happy kind of feeling. So I think sometimes when there is the barriers to that, and the other thing that's just come to my mind that came out is a lot of the participants felt that the education at the moment was reward and achievement led rather than child led. So you were judged on the results. It's all results led rather than child led. That was another kind of frustration that came through.
Tell us a bit more what you mean by child led.
So instead of actually celebrating the achievements of the child, regardless of what that achievement is, and for some children, let's face it, at the moment, the achievement is actually being able to walk into school at 9 o'clock in the morning. It's what has that child achieved? What level are they? So have you met the individual education plan targets? Have they been able to reach level 4 in their maths? Have they been able to? You have pupil performance meetings and it's all about the results. What are the children going to achieve at the end of this year? Rather than perhaps celebrating more those really small steps that are actually key to learning, which is making sure that students and teachers are happy, are learning, are positive, recognise that they may not be there yet, quoting Carol Dweck, but they will get there in the future.
I think it sounds, you could almost take what you said there, Gillian, and apply that to a teacher. So you're saying, when children come into school, are they achieving their levels? And celebrating the small steps of success. There's no difference. Yes, we're older, but there's no difference in us in emotions. And, having that sort of, for want of a better phrase, teacher looking after us and, celebrating our successes. Did anything come out in terms of process management like that in your research that would enhance the resilience within teachers?
Mike, it's interesting that you've said that, because that's completely what Gulfinch Enterprises, the business that I'm developing, is totally and utterly about. What came out of my research was that these participants had priorities and they had perspective. What I've been finding in some of the work that I've done recently since my degree is exactly what you have just described, is talking to the teacher and the teacher looking after themselves and the teacher thinking, I haven't quite done this yet, but I will get there. The teacher actually recognising their self-worth. I mean, I should say educator, because I've worked with senior leaders and I've worked with teaching assistants. And actually I did do some work with lunchtime assistants as well. So, but it is all exactly what you have just said. We apply growth mindset to the pupils, but educators are not actually applying it to themselves. So I said earlier about self-comparison. Instead of saying, oh my goodness me, that teacher's doing that lesson exceptionally well, I can't do this, go into that teacher and say, help me. What is it that you're doing? That looks like it's working really well. Share your expertise with me. I think guilt and self-blame are key factors as well in some of the educators that I work with. And it's exactly that, Mike. It's looking after ourselves first so that we can be the best we can for those pupils.
2 questions for you, Jill. How do we look after ourselves first? And the second one is, how do we reduce that self-comparison factor?
I think how we look after our first is, first of all, recognizing that we are responsible for our own well-being, that we are able to set barriers and boundaries, that we, recognizing the things that we do well, recognizing what has worked today rather than what hasn't, recognizing that these people that start off in education have got degrees, they've done professional qualifications, they've had 2 years of early career development. So they actually, once they get to that kind of their 3rd year and they've got that almost rubber stamp, they are qualified professionals and they have a range of knowledge and a range of experience. And I think just making sure that they have self-awareness, they know what their triggers are, they recognize what they control and what they don't control, that they are positive. If they need help and support, they go and get it, and that they are basically human beings. We all make mistakes. We need to forgive ourselves, learn from it, and move on.
And how do you get that recognition that they are human beings? Where does that begin culturally?
I think basically, where does that begin? I suppose that begins with a teacher allowing themselves to be human. I think it's interesting because I've done lots of observations. I've done lots of drop-ins throughout my whole career. And you always hear, it's written upon working walls and it's written upon boards, teachers and educators saying, it's all right to make a mistake. You learn from your mistakes. Oh, that's a marvellous mistake. Let's all learn from our mistakes. And yet I find educators go, oh, I did this wrong, and that didn't work, and this didn't work. Rather than say to themselves, okay, I made a bit of a mistake today, but what can I learn from it and how can I improve tomorrow?
When you speak, it sounds like you're saying the answer comes from within the person. However, earlier in our conversation, you said there's a fear of judgment within the education sector. How do we reduce the judgment factor so that educators can have that dialogue internally with themselves that it's okay to make a mistake?
I think recognizing skills and recognizing achievements. One of the educators I've worked with recently, we talked about having a mantra and saying, I'm a good teacher, I can do this. I'm a good teacher, I can do this. And this was a person who had self-doubt. And they came back to me and said, I used to every morning just go into my cupboard before the children came in and say, I'm a good teacher, I can do this. I'm a good teacher, I can do this. And then go out into the classroom. And that really helped them, just having that mantra and recognizing their own skills rather than having somebody else tell them, recognizing actually I've done this worked. I know that I'm going to improve. We improve all the time. I've been teaching 34 years and I'm still learning new things every single day. So I think maybe it does kind of come from within.
Yeah, it's going back to the sort of the supervision and line management angle that you were talking about before. We talk as psychologists about things that we can control and things that are beyond our control. And we can control to some extent how we're thinking and feeling. But we can't always control how a line manager is going to talk to us and develop that. So is there anything in your research that would just drop 1 or 2 suggestions into line management conversations that would enhance people's self-value and self-belief, etc.? Is there anything that you've seen like that?
I don't think there was anything in my research that linked to that. I think the only thing that came out of my research was that some of the participants felt that managerial influences and control were a factor in why they may actually leave the profession. I think for a line manager, it might be just, and I know lots of line managers that actually do this. I think it's just maybe building up a trust and just recognizing that I have never, ever, ever met anybody in education who has gone into that role to do anything but the best that they can possibly do. So starting from a kind of a supporting, a helping, we're all human, we all can learn something new. And I think one of the key things maybe also listening. So it's very, very difficult and there's lots of pressure. And I've been in SLT and I've been a line manager, and you have a little tick list and you need to get through jobs quickly. Yeah. And quite often, if somebody is doing really, really well, you don't say anything, which again speaks volumes, because you don't need to. And you move on to the more kind of areas where support is needed. And maybe just giving a little bit of time and just listening and just recognizing perhaps how you might be being perceived. So I was just saying again, another colleague of mine basically said, well, they came in, they watched me, and they just gave me 2 areas of development, and that was it. And I said, that's because everything else is brilliant.
Yeah, but you don't know that until you're told. But what I like about what you've just said there is the listening. In my own career, when I've experienced good supervision and bad supervision, the bad supervision has been one suggestion after another. So what do I do here? Well, try this. I've tried that. Well, try this. Well, I've tried that as well. The good supervision is listening and getting me to reflect on what I'm doing and asking myself and answering so ask myself questions and answering my questions. And when you're talking there about listening, it just prompted that. And Adam and I have talked in previous episodes about building rapport with children. And we've drawn on Carl Rogers' approach, which is very much about building that rapport. And one of the things is listening, active listening, really tuning into what people are saying.
The key thing you're saying there's active listening, not just listening, active listening. Showing the other person you're reflecting back to them that you're taking on board what they're saying. Sorry, Mike, finish your point.
That was it, really. It was just to pick up on what you'd said, because you answer to my question, Gillian, was about what sort of things could we drop into line management approaches. And I think active listening is one of those golden nuggets that we just overlook, but it's so powerful.
And it really builds on, Gillian said about building trust between the teacher and the line manager. And working in education for 15 odd years, that has become rhetoric. It's almost like the words the politicians say, we got to build trust. It's a bit like hearing change in a political debate. It means nothing until you start to look underneath. And, earlier in your chat, Gillian, you said policy development. And when you have a supervision policy that has a framework that line managers can use, that is the beginning of building trust. And, Mike and I in our earlier podcast, we talk a lot about different psychological theories, and I talk a lot about communities of practice. When you have policies that are geared towards human interaction and how to do that in a positive way, you will see that meaningful change. So if we go through the key points that you've talked about, trust, building relationships with students, alleviating judgment, staff comparison, when your policy development reflects an interaction that targets those difficult areas, you will see a change, in my view and in my experience. Jill, we've been talking for a little while now, and we're coming to the end of this podcast, and I want to leave with one question I'm hoping you can answer, and if you can't, that's okay. Change.
No pressure.
Change one thing overnight, just one thing, what would improve staff retention?
I think it would be, and I feel really passionate about this, is educators understanding their own psychology and understanding emotional intelligence. That's what I would say. I think from the research I've done and from the learning I've done, I think it is absolutely vital, following Goleman's emotional intelligence in the workplace, that educators have self-awareness, self-control, and self-assessment. And I think that would be the first step on these educators not only wanting to stay in education, but also continuing to experience the joy and the excitement and the influence and the importance of the role that they do.
Nicely put. You know, Adam, that reminds me of taking something like Maslow's hierarchy and mapping that directly onto what you've just said, Gillian. Particularly with things like self-assessment. Well, where do I go if I've self-assessed? And as if you've got the Maslow's and you've got your physical needs being met and you feel comfortable and you have a sense of belonging, you can then go along to somebody, can't you?
That's right.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for coming on today. We really appreciate having you, and thank you so much for sharing your research. It's fabulous to hear.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed having this conversation.
Thank you, Gillian. Nice to meet you.
Yes, lovely. Nice to meet you both.
Thanks, Adam.